Today we are joined by Dr. Sarah Lonelodge. Dr. Lonelodge is an assistant professor of English at Eastern New Mexico University. Her research interests include propagandist intersections with religion and/or politics, rhetoric and professional writing, pedagogy and writing studies, and writing program administration. Dr. Lonelodge's research often centers on Scientology and other new religious movements. Her dissertation focused on an analysis of Scientology's propaganda strategies as discussed in Hubbard's policy letters and is currently seen on various Scientology websites such as Stand and Freedom magazine. She has also published a number of articles on Scientology practices and beliefs. Her analysis of Scientology as a pseudo-countercultural movement appeared recently in the Lamar Journal of Humanities, and her study of L. Ron Hubbard's propaganda strategies is forthcoming from the International Journal of Coercion, Abuse, and Manipulation, or IJCAM. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Dr. Lonelodge.
Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Lonelodge. I am an assistant professor of English at Eastern New Mexico University. Today I'd like to discuss my research on the Church of Scientology and their use of propaganda among and within the various levels of this organization. This research stems from an article that I published in the International Journal of Coercion, Abuse, and Manipulation. To begin, I'll provide a very brief and extremely condensed history and context regarding Scientology. Next, I'll discuss some examples of manipulation and other actions of Scientologists. And finally, I'll discuss my analysis of Scientology policy letters, as well as my findings and what significance this analysis has. The Church of Scientology effectively began with founder L. Ron Hubbard, who was a well-established science fiction writer who published hundreds of novels and short stories and emerged as one of the most prolific writers of the golden era of science fiction. Hubbard published his book Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, in 1950, and the success of this book led to a number of small group meetings in which people applied these Dianetics techniques as a form of self-help or informal therapy sessions. Much of the success of Dianetics and eventually Scientology rests on Hubbard's personal life and on the research that Hubbard claimed to have conducted. The growth of this practice eventually led to the establishment of the first Church of Scientology in 1954 in Los Angeles, California. Although Hubbard insisted that Scientology had been under attack since its inception, these accusations created additional negative publicity. To respond to attackers and negative press, Hubbard established a group of high-ranking COS officials within the Sea Org who were tasked with numerous initiatives aimed at protecting the Scientology image. These initiatives involved the use of propaganda and an effort to combat what Hubbard considered to be the propaganda campaigns of attackers. In bidding COS officials to conduct propaganda campaigns themselves, Hubbard called for responses to attackers and negative press that functioned as both persuasive strategies and as legitimization tactics. A useful definition of propaganda, specifically for religious propaganda, should focus on the strategies and purposes inclusive of the ideological foundations, whereas communication scholars Garth Jowett and Victoria O'Donnell write a definition that focuses on the communication process, most specifically on the purpose of the process. I argue, therefore, that Jowett and O'Donnell's definition of propaganda is among the most useful for religious propaganda. They write, propaganda is the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. Although the characteristics, criteria, and ideological foundations are invaluable to a full analysis of propaganda, the initial identification of communication as propaganda should rely on a definition that takes both the process and the intentions into consideration. In this way, although the ideology and beliefs are essential aspects of the analysis, they are not the emphasis for identification. Currently, the COS partakes in propagandistic strategies in line with Jowett and O'Donnell's definition in order to propel itself as an organization and as a religion, as well as to gain and maintain followers. For example, in its efforts to shape perceptions of itself as a religion rather than a business or a cult, the COS creates media that deliberately addresses specific issues that critics cite in an effort to redefine itself as a religious organization. This effort is incredibly systematic in that it uses multiple media platforms scholarly sources, and deeply held religious beliefs to manipulate cognitions of followers and the larger public by working to alter assumptions and quell the rumors surrounding the COS. In doing so, Scientology as propagandist directs behavior to achieve a purpose that furthers its desired intent, which is to legitimize itself as a religious organization and extend its base of followers. Often these practices are responses to media coverage that is deemed problematic. For example, many critics have publicly questioned tax exemptions for religious status, and many former members have filed lawsuits. In addition, several ex-Scientologists have participated in interviews and provided additional information for news programs, documentary films, journalist articles, and academic research. These public statements have influenced the public's perception of Scientology and have resulted in significant backlash for the church. In response, they have produced a number of materials targeted at public audiences and/or at Scientology members in an effort to respond to and counter these allegations. Hubbard often describes specific practices and strategies for addressing negative press through COS propaganda campaigns aimed at any person, group, or organization disseminating negative information regarding Scientology through intimidation efforts, name-calling, and much more. The specific methods for propaganda are found in Hubbard's policy letters, which were written in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and were produced via the Hubbard Communications Office, or the HCO. Scientology's history of propaganda production can be traced to these policy letters, which were created for high-ranking Sea Org members whose role was to protect Scientology. They were established in 1966 and were called the Guardian's Office. The Guardian's Office, directed by Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, functioned as an intelligence bureau and was created to protect the interests of the Church of Scientology and gather information on agencies and individuals deemed as enemies, and to monitor heretics and notable apostates. Only individuals deemed most loyal and trustworthy would have been chosen for positions in the Guardian's Office, and only after they proved themselves to be wholeheartedly devoted to the organization. These individuals operated in a variety of intelligence capacities until 1983, and their various activities led to raids of Scientology offices and criminal trials. Indictments of 11 Guardian's Office officers, including Mary Sue, subjected the church to public scrutiny and led to the emergence of new leadership and a major international reorganization. Following the disbanding of the Guardian's Office, the church created the Office of Special Affairs International, OSAI, which currently coordinates public relations and legal affairs as part of the Church of Scientology International. Due to the secretive nature of Scientology, the designs of the COS, and how the OSAI create and disseminate materials aimed at countering accusations is not well researched. I believe that this study may shed light onto these practices, as I have access to a number of HCO policy letters that Hubbard wrote for the Guardian's Office. These policy letters identify a number of strategies that GO agents should utilize in order to respond to attackers. By analyzing these policy letters, I'm able to investigate the practices in current COS response materials, because as I mentioned, current leader David Miscavige seems to have no real power without Hubbard. I believe that he continues to employ Hubbard's directives for propaganda. Therefore, in this study, I address the following research questions. According to the HCO policy letters, what strategies are to be employed by COS administrators in order to contest what it deems to be anti-Scientology propaganda? Are these strategies identifiable in current COS responsive materials? To analyze the policy letters, I utilize grounded theory, a methodology that allows for recursive analysis and reflection, as well as open coding of communication in order to identify various themes or categories. For the study, I analyzed 7 policy letters, originating from the HCO Hubbard Communications Office and utilized by the COS Guardian's Office for training purposes during its tenure with the COS. Part of the training course, the intelligence course check sheet contains 5 sections. Part C contains 10 steps, 7 of which are requirements to read policy letters with titles referring to propaganda. These policy letters are the focus of this study as they present specific strategies that GO agents were to use in response to anti-Scientology propaganda. From my analysis, I was able to identify two overarching categories with several subcategories of strategies that Hubbard wrote into policy as ways of responding to negative press. The two larger categories were prevention and handling. The first strategy Hubbard directed Guardian's Office agents to use when Black propaganda was imminent was prevention. Within many of the policy letters, this was the most advantageous form of combating Black propaganda or any other type of entheta press. Rather than publishing propaganda necessitating a response, prevention techniques stopped or slowed the propaganda before the public was able to see it and thus react to it. It's a simpler, more effective strategy. I identified two subcategories within this category: groundwork and spokesperson. I use the term groundwork to refer to a number of strategies Hubbard created to establish a foothold in a new community or area. For example, he instructed GO agents to investigate local officials to avoid stepping on toes, but also to promise things as needed or to avoid suspicion. Groundwork also refers to the creation of public relations packs in which the church collected materials to present to the press in advance. These packs might have positive news articles, documents outlining good things Scientology is or would be doing, and so on, in an effort to preemptively counter any negative press from a third party. The other strategy in prevention is the use of a spokesperson. Essentially, the idea here is to have a person available to comment on or give an interview when needed. Hubbard wrote that the advantages here are to block a story until the legal team could obtain an injunction. An essential aspect of prevention was that the COS appeared to be an open organization that was always available to communicate with the media. However, Hubbard indicated that only stories allowed in publication should be those that are COS positive. In addition, there is little indication of truthfulness or accuracy in prevention methods. For instance, the Guardian's Office agents may invent or exaggerate if needed. Essentially, the goal of the prevention technique was to block negative stories by discrediting the informant. When prevention was not effective or not effective enough, policy letters discuss handling. The chief maneuvers for handling include three subcategories: discrediting the source, disproving, adding to or changing the content, and swaying appearance. Though Hubbard did not specifically or explicitly outline a particular order for public relations to employ handling techniques, one of the first, or at least most important, was to determine, investigate, and discredit the source of information. As I mentioned previously, Paulette Cooper, who was framed for a bomb threat, was subject to this tactic. The goal was to get her fired, put in an institution, or to get her to commit suicide at one point. So these are obliteration tactics. A second subcategory discussed in conjunction with or following the handling of a source was the handling of the content of the false report. This technique falls into two categories: disproving or changing content. In either method, the content of the false report is the focus. The most extensively discussed method for disproving content was to perform a process called dead agenting. This course of action consists of disproving the false statement with documents or demonstration or display. One has to have a kit or the ability to demonstrate or something to display. The central action then was to counter the falsehoods with proof that shows contrary information with proof or documentation. Again, there's no indication that the documentation needs to be legal or verifiable in any way beyond casting enough doubt to drop a story. When Scientology could not disprove an accusation, Hubbard wrote that GO agents should employ the technique of changing content. This move allows the COS to change the focus of negative press. The goal, therefore, was not to deny or coerce the media source to retract the false information. Instead, they shifted the story for the benefit of Scientology through the use of PR packs, as previously discussed. However, additional techniques were employed as well, such as discussing positive aspects of Scientology. However, as seen in the prevention strategies, Hubbard provided no indication of truthfulness or accuracy requirements. The final overarching subcategory in handling was the move to sway appearance by reshaping the source and/or the public's perception of the COS. Hubbard wrote that GO agents should present themselves and therefore the organization as moral, positive persons, or if necessary, they should show force when speaking with a reporter or other source. Hubbard discussed casting the COS in a positive light through Guardian's Office agents' alterations of negative assumptions concerning Scientology. This goal was achieved through techniques such as acting as the face of the organization, by showing good deeds through memberships and other publicized good works, and proving the nature of a Scientologist as a good person within an organization. They also focused attacks on certain kinds of evils, those accepted as common negative factors to many people in society. Importantly, these goals seem to be one of the chief functions of the propaganda arms, such as Narconon. Members can show that they are part of Narconon, which is an anti-drug league, even if it doesn't work or actually does more harm than good. The swaying appearance technique established the desired public persona of the Scientology Church, therefore individual Scientologists as good, moral people. It also involved creating a vision of the COS as a powerful organization that is worthy of respect, certainly, and fear if necessary. Importantly, within this subcategory, Hubbard offered several indications of the lengths his agents may go to, including getting reporters fired or discredited, or throwing someone through the ground floor window if needed. The results of this study indicate that several strategies for combating anti-COS propaganda exist in the HCO policy letters. From my analysis, Hubbard created 9 directives listed here. These include creating a safe point, distributing PR packs, designating a spokesperson, determining the source of Black propaganda and working to discredit them, providing documentation to disprove negative press, avoid denying negative content, casting Scientology as a moral organization, accusing attackers of utilizing Black propaganda and then attacking Black propaganda, and intimidating sources of negative press when necessary. The 9 directives I've identified indicate purposeful, intentional methods of preventing and handling anti-Scientology press, as Hubbard outlined. The HCO policy letters utilize propaganda in order to present strategies for employing propaganda as a means of combating the propaganda of enemies. They are also directly from a source credible beyond all others to the audience, tasked with reading and implementing these strategies, which was Hubbard. Hubbard's position within the COS imbued him with additional ethos and power within this organization. This may have influenced his followers to partake in problematic or morally questionable activities at his request. I suggest that the identification of these techniques might enable further study on the COS and its counter-propaganda or propaganda techniques. For example, Jowett and O'Donnell's definition of propaganda is also applicable to the policy letters themselves. Hubbard, as propagandist, shaped and manipulated the cognitions and behaviors of his GO agents to further his desired intent to legitimize Scientology and increase the size of the church through the use of propaganda aimed at the press, public, and lower-ranking members of this church. Determining what makes Hubbard's policy letters effective propaganda is also an important task, as it may illuminate other facets of religious propaganda practices. As high-ranking members of the COS, Guardian's Office agents, currently OSAI members, did not necessarily have access to external sources of information. In this way, the COS subjects them to a hermeneutical injustice, which occurs when a group is systematically denied access to the resources to conceptualize their social world correctly. Essentially, the lack of outside information creates a skewed idea of reasonableness and rationality. As such, Scientology members accept the methods Hubbard discussed in the policy letters as moral, as they are commands from the leader of their religion. If we combine these gaps with the intended audience's linked beliefs, Hubbard's directives are not only unchallengeable, but are also true and moral for followers. Though the directives condone the use of lies, manipulation, coercion, violence, obliteration, and similar tactics, the intended audience would have little recourse or desire to question any of Hubbard's directives due to his position as founder, leader, and savior. He literally wrote that Scientology is the only thing that could save the earth from destruction. Scientologists believe they are saving the world, So Hubbard often gets into the ends justify the means policies and ideologies. The use of religion to condone violence and manipulation is not a new concept, but perhaps this practice deserves further scrutiny as, to borrow Hubbard's term, dirty propaganda. So I have developed this theory of dirty propaganda campaigns as those that justify socially unacceptable practices through religious belief, thus deeming them moral and ethical responses for followers because they are presented by religious leaders. But what does COS religious propaganda look like today? 30 to 40 years ago, when Hubbard wrote these several dozen policy letters, the goal was typically to publish this information through articles in popular newspapers and magazines. However, with the publishing capabilities available via the internet, the COS currently manifests these directives through digital media. As Joad and O'Donnell write, this move is consistent with propaganda organizations. Often where propaganda is distributed, the organization owns and controls its own media. Whoever owns the media exercises control over the communication of messages, end quote. Considering the vast amount of information created and circulated by the COS about Scientology and its attackers, this practice of distributing a somewhat balanced amount of COS positive and attacker negative information seems to be ongoing in much the same ways that Hubbard outlined in his decade-old policy letters. Looking at current uses of those 9 directives, we see mostly digital media. To address my second research question, I analyzed one source of current COS response materials in order to determine if Hubbard's directives are still in use. Scientologists taking action against discrimination, or the Stand League website. Based on my analysis, Stand functions as propaganda in line with Joad and O'Donnell's definition. One prominent method employed on the Stand website is the publication of white papers in response to accusations and assumptions about the organization. I argue that the OSAI chose to communicate via white papers as an attempt to control the flow of information, a strategy that presents a distorted information from what appears to be a credible source. The legitimacy garnered through the perceived facticity of the white paper likely prompted its selection as a medium for propaganda in order to disseminate information in a way that seems objectively true. This genre selection falls in line with Hubbard's directives, such as presenting information through credible sources, providing documentation, presenting the COS in a positive way, and more. Within the Stand white papers, I was able to identify many of Hubbard's directives. For example, the white papers provide specific evidence and seemingly logical connections between claims and evidence that mimic common efforts to offer credible support. As such, the Stand white papers include quotes from experts, comparisons to alternative religions, and summaries of court cases. However, this evidence is typically misleading, false, decontextualized, or lacking information. For example, in a Stand white paper focused on the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is a program associated with forcing non-compliant members to scrub floors with toothbrushes, the authors provide an extensive description of the RPF from the perspective of the COS, as well as comparisons to programs in other religions. However, it adheres to Hubbard's Directive 4 in that it specifically works to discredit Dr. Stephen Kent's study on the RPF. The white paper reads, Kent's study is not only suspect because it is premised upon misinformation and constitutes non-valid pseudoscience, it also is suspect because of Kent's inherent bias on the subject of Scientology and new religions. The white paper goes on to question Kent's study in terms of the methods employed, which was interviewing 6 apostates, as well as its theoretical basis. Discrediting tactics fall in line with Phil Lord's contention that Scientology has actively sought to discredit the experts it disagrees with. Dr. Kent is the foremost expert on Scientology. He's appeared in basically every documentary created on Scientology and has published numerous peer-reviewed papers. Considering the larger context of Hubbard's directives, the overarching aim of Stand white papers is clearly to benefit the COS and attack or handle opponents, rather than to offer fact-based information that would ethically support the decision-making processes of its audience, which is the goal of white papers. For example, in Directive 8, Hubbard called on GO agents to accuse attackers of employing propaganda and then attack propaganda in order to coerce the public into viewing the attackers as evil. In White Paper 7, the authors write, "Today's seeds of violence come from biased media propagandists such as Lawrence Wright and Alex Gibney in their bigoted books and films. These, in turn, are picked up by hate mongers such as Tony Ortega, Leah Remini, Mark Headley, and others with potentially catastrophic results." Clearly, the Stan White Papers continue to employ Hubbard's directives. The use of a highly discoverable, well-designed website furthers the potential of these responsive materials. Importantly, then, we must consider that with the publication of Stan White Papers, COS propaganda extends beyond followers and into the propagandizing of the larger public. In addition to Stan White Papers, Hubbard's GO directives are visible in other COS materials and media. Perhaps most notably, Directives 6 and 7 are currently in use via the COS's own television network, through which the Church is able to, for example, present its own profiles of prominent Scientologists. This practice results in readily available positive press and a catalog of current members' good deeds. By controlling the flow of information through this enterprise, the Church is able to present only favorable information to the public, rather than relying on non-COS outlets to publish positive stories. The strategies discussed in this study are not necessarily unique to Scientology, and I suggest that a number of religious and secular organizations and groups could be analyzed in ways similar to those I have identified. For example, The Vow, a documentary chronicling NXIVM, a cult group accused of numerous crimes, including sex trafficking and branding women, among other offenses, utilizes similar techniques. The documentary discusses harassment and silencing of defectors and provides several instances in which leader Keith Raniere employed strategies akin to intimidation, harassment, and so on. Further investigation of this group would also likely show similar methods of propagandizing followers using dirty propaganda. I believe there are also political groups that could certainly be utilizing similar tactics, even if they aren't strictly religious in nature. Analyses of internal and external propaganda strategies within religious groups are important endeavors. As Pernod writes, "We are today witnessing the return of religion. This is why it is important, and perhaps why it is the duty of us academics and intellectuals to find new ways of thinking about religion in a world where unthinking and depraved uses of religion can be dangerous." Within organizations such as the COS, the intricately intertwined, dirty propaganda tactics pull on one another, continually tightening and constantly strengthening the hold on followers. This practice deserves further scrutiny so that we may better understand the hold on followers of Scientology, as well as other groups, and the utilization of these tactics on the public. Thank you.